We have Mark Caleb Smith, Director of the Center for Political Studies at Cedarville University. Dr. Smith, thank you so much for coming back. So ostensibly this case is about birthright citizenship, but the argument lawyers and justices really weigh today is looking at limiting the scope of power when it comes to federal judges issuing preliminary nationwide injunctions. Mark, why is this case so important?
Yeah, I think the two issues that you raised are certainly critical. So there's the substantive issue of whether or not the president really has the power to issue this sort of executive order. And of course, that drags in the 14th Amendment and the meaning of the 14th Amendment as it relates to birthright citizenship. But then we also have this more procedural, technical issue about how much authority does a court have, especially like a district court, when it makes a decision about an executive order or a law that's been put in place. Should that judge have the power to issue, as you said, a universal injunction, which basically blocks the effect of that law or executive order across the entire nation? Certainly the Trump White House thinks that judges should not have that power. And of course, there are people who are pushing against it.
Well, Justices Thomas and Gorsuch described nationwide injunctions before this case as legally and historically dubious. On the other side today, Justice Sotomayor said the president's executive order violates 4 Supreme Court precedents, and then asked how injunctions can be applied to individual jurisdictions rather than nationally. Mark, where do you suspect the court is leaning after hearing the justices' line of questioning today?
You know, I think usually you can listen to an oral argument and have a pretty educated guess, but I think the issues here present a really complicated question for the court. I think there's pretty much a universal recognition that President Trump's executive order here is unconstitutional, and therefore the justices are sort of unwilling to go so far as to say, well, maybe these universal injunctions shouldn't be relevant in a case like this one, when the case is so open and closed against the president. And additionally, the effects of this kind of executive order would be pretty traumatic, potentially. So let's say that a judge in one district says, I'm going to issue this order, but it only applies to the people in my district. A judge in another district doesn't issue that kind of an order. So then you have people being born in one state versus being born in another state with a birth certificate in one state but not in the other state. And we end up in these very complicated legal situations. And so I think that the facts of this case actually make it much harder for the court to deal with the underlying issue of the universal injunctions. And so I think generally they've been skeptical of it because it can be abused. You know, we've seen judges abuse this power across various administrations. But I think in a case like this one, where it seems to be pretty open and shut, they may not be willing to really draw a hard line, at least right here.
All right, Dr. Mark Caleb Smith with Cedarville University, thank you so much for your time and your insights tonight.